Sorry, everyone. That's okay. The housekeeping doesn't necessarily need to be on record. But Kim Klett, she has a master's in English from ASU, and she has taught at Dobson since 1991. And in addition to teaching, she is a museum teacher fellow with the United States Holocaust Museum, United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, sorry. She is also a teacher trainer for Echoes and Reflections and a Carl Wilkins Fellow. So I will let her expand on her introduction should she choose, and we will turn the time over for her and her wonderful presentation.
Great, thank you so much, Mandy, and thank you for your help today. I appreciate your making this so easy for us. I'm going to show just a couple of quick slides, and then we're going to go right to the website. I am a classroom teacher. This is my 30th year of teaching at the same high school in Mesa, Arizona. And I teach a year-long, it started a semester long, now it's a year-long Holocaust literature course. And so that's kind of how I got into, this segment. If you guys could mute yourselves, that would be awesome. Thank you. And then, so Echoes and Reflections, for those of you who aren't familiar with us, we're actually going to be doing another program in May with the Department of Education. It's a specialty program. So what we're doing today is kind of an overview. I'm going to give you a lot of activities and lessons that you could take right back to the classroom on Monday and use in your classroom if you chose to do so, or are ready to teach about the Holocaust or add to what you already teach. It's very user-friendly, and my goal at the end of our time together is that you feel really comfortable using this. I know some of you may be familiar with Echoes and Reflections. I will mention they have changed a lot in this past year. So they've updated the lessons, the units have been revamped, and so I'll be highlighting some of those when we get to the website in just a few minutes. And so Echoes and Reflections has been around since 2005. We support middle school and high school educators, social studies, English, really any discipline where you're teaching about the Holocaust. We've worked with more than 104,000 teachers across the United States since our inception. And we have 3 partners. I work for the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, in this capacity as a trainer. The Anti-Defamation League has been around for well over 100 years, fighting for the civil rights of all people. We also partner with USC Shoah Foundation. They were founded by Steven Spielberg after he made Schindler's List and made it his mission to film every Holocaust survivor that he could find and get their stories recorded. So we'll be looking at a couple of clips from those today. And then we also partner with Yad Vashem, which is the premier Holocaust museum and memorial in Israel. We always begin with our pedagogical principles. We want to make sure that with every unit, every training, every lesson that we're covering these aspects. So we want to look at defining terms and examining anti-Semitism. We're going to hit those 2 right away in the first unit we look at. We always want to provide historical context. With those video clips, as I was telling you, we teach the human story. This isn't just facts and figures and dates. And we want to use primary sources. And then in addition to those, and I want you to think about, how in your current planning and instruction do you already do these? And then how can you apply these going forward with making the Holocaust relevant to your students, encouraging critical thinking, ensuring a supportive learning environment, and then fostering empathy. And so those are all pieces that we're going to be looking at today. So I am going to next take you, and since we're a small group, please feel free at any time if you're not following or you don't catch something. I want to make sure, again, that you know how to use this. So please feel free to speak up or put it in the chat box if that's more comfortable, but I'm happy with you unmuting and asking questions and making sure that you really understand this. So you can either follow along with me on the website, I'm going to share it here, or you can do it on your own device. and follow along. I think that way is probably easier for you to learn with me, but whatever works for you is great. So it's just echoesandreflections.org. There's no sign in. Anybody can access this. So please do share it with your friends and colleagues. It's a fabulous resource. When we started in 2005, we had these big binders. They were really bulky. I still have one. And we had to send them everywhere that we went and did these presentations. And it was kind of difficult. So it's really nice having everything in one place now. Speaking of that, though, if you like this program, or if you come to our one on May 19th and like it, we are coming back in person at no cost to teachers. We will come out to a district or to a school. You know, if we can get a good number of teachers together, a region, however it might work or look, and we can do these in-person programs as well. So feel free to reach out to us or, you know, check in with your experts there. So once we're here on Echoes and Reflections, we're going to mostly be in Teach. These other menu bars have really good stuff in them. If you want to catch some webinars that we've done, you can go to Prepare. You can see there's one coming up to honor Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance. But we're going to be in the Teach category for all of our time together here today. And under Teach, there's our pedagogy that we were just looking at. We're going to go to lesson plans, and really, I wish they'd change the name, because the lesson plans are units. They really are units. And you can see here we have 11 units, and we're going to be looking, I'm going to kind of give you what I call the greatest hits, okay, just from the first 3 units so today. So when you click on them, it will take you to the unit. So we're going to start with studying the Holocaust. Every unit is set up exactly the same. So you have a quote that's from one of the testimonies. You have keywords over here that are unique for every unit, which I love. You have everything you need over here to set yourselves up. You have essential questions, an intro to the unit. This is all for you as a teacher. You have your standards. When you click on here, it will open up for both social studies and ELA standards. And again, those are unique for every lesson. So it outlines everything that you're doing. So those are great if you have to turn in lesson plans. There are your objectives. And again, if I can just say, this is fabulous for brand new teachers or teachers new to teaching about the Holocaust, because it gives you everything you need scripted. If you're like me and you're more, I'm not going to say old, I'm going to say seasoned, right? Veteran teacher. These are great because you can take what you like and kind of plug in and supplement or replace things that you find that you like better on Echoes and Reflections. And then each unit has lesson plans. So here, this is appropriate to use. So we're going to start, and you can see it has everything you need here in the middle. You have testimonies. We're going to get to some of these. These are fabulous, by the way, these first 2, but I'm not going to use those today. What we're going to start with, because I said we were going to look at definitions, is this is an activity I use at the beginning of the year for my students. I teach high school seniors, but I've heard junior high teachers say that they really like this as well. So if we're working with defining the Holocaust for our students, this is a good place to start, right? And so we have the USHMM, which is the one that I use the most. You also have a definition from Yad Vashem, and then you have the Imperial War Museum in London. So let's start together, and I'll just leave this up for those of you who are following along with me, and I'll read through it and you can follow along. So the Holocaust was the systematic, state-sponsored persecution and murder of 6 million Jews by the Nazi regime and its allies and collaborators. Holocaust is a word of Greek origin meaning sacrifice by fire. The Nazis, who came to power in Germany in January 1933, believed that Germans were racially superior and that the Jews, deemed inferior, were an alien threat to the so-called German racial community. During the era of the Holocaust, German authorities also targeted other groups because of their perceived racial and biological inferiority. Roma, or gypsies, people with disabilities, some of the Slavic peoples like Poles, Russians, and others, Soviet prisoners of wars, and Black people. Other groups were persecuted on political, ideological, and behavioral grounds, among them communities, communists, that would be different, communists, socialists, Jehovah's Witnesses, and homosexuals. All right, so thinking about your students who will be in front of you again on Monday, what are some terms that you would need to break down with them? And go ahead and either unmute or put it in the chat box. What are some terms that you would have to kind of unpack for them or help them with? Nazi, Roma, yeah. Any others? And again, you can unmute if you prefer. Jews, and we're actually going to look at that in the next unit. Poles, Jehovah's Witnesses, yeah, a lot of my students don't know that one. Communists. So looking at the different groups that were persecuted, right, we would have to break that down. And again, who they are, and then again, how it falls under either racial and biological inferiority according to the Nazis, or is it political, ideological, and behavioral, right? And what does that look like? What does that mean, applying that to people? One that, you know, for my seniors, I don't have to necessarily explain it, but I do have to kind of clarify, is just this word even, systematic. State-sponsored, they think state, I'm in Arizona, they think Arizona, right? They're not thinking Germany, right? So looking at that, persecution versus prosecution, because some of them mix those two words up, right? Looking at allies and collaborators. So there's so much in this, and I will be honest, I spend an entire day just on these definitions because there's so much to be unpacked with this. But again, depending on the level of your students, depending on what your focus is, you could just use this definition or one of the others, or you could have them look at, for example, the other two. So Yad Vashem, let's just look at that one, and then I'll just gloss over the third one in the interest of time. But Yad Vashem tells us it was an unprecedented genocide. So again, we might have to unpack that word, right, with our students. There's that word systematic again, perpetrated, Nazi Germany and its collaborators with the aim of annihilating the Jewish people. I always mention to my students that, you know, annihilating is such a strong word, but that's what they did. So we use, again, talking about using our terms, we use, it was murder, it was execution, it was annihilation, right? The primary motivation was the Nazis' anti-Semitic racist ideology, which we're going to unpack in just a few minutes. Here we get dates. So between 1933 and 1941, Nazi Germany pursued a policy that dispossessed, there's another word, the Jews of their rights and their property, followed by the branding and concentration of the Jewish population. This policy gained broad support in Germany and much of occupied Europe. In 1941, following the invasion of the Soviet Union, the Nazis and their collaborators launched the systematic mass murder, again, strong words, of the Jews. By 1945, nearly 6 million Jews had been murdered. It's also interesting to talk about why these are so brief, right? Because these are just these basic definitions that these museums, these institutions use. And again, thinking about why they're different, why they change. For example, this first one by USHMM, I am not sure, I'd have to go back to their website and look, but I think it might have been changed since this was published because it's an evolving document. It's not something that stays stagnant. And again, that's a great conversation. Talk about critical thinking, right? In this one, notice that it focuses on the Jews. And my students often notice that, but you know, whereas this one mentions these other groups, this one just mentions the Jews. Well, why is that? Right? Look where it's from, right? It's from a Jewish state, and that is their mission. It's not that they don't recognize the other victims, they certainly do, but their focus is on the Jewish victims, right? And then the Imperial War Museum, again, I'm not going to read through this whole one, but it has more of the focus on war and what happened. And you still get, you know, the victims certainly, but it's definitely looking at, and you get the other victims here, but it's certainly looking at how this happened, talking about like industrial methods, right? So this is a great activity to begin a unit with, and I'll just show you that there's also this handout. I used this year because this is one of the new things they added to this unit, if you're familiar with this one. It's a great graphic organizer. So again, if you're limited on time, you could give those definitions as homework, have the kids fill this out, bring it back the next day, and have them kind of compare and contrast their notes with each other. So looking at, again, who are the victims, who are the perpetrators, what are their motives, and then looking at the terms used to emphasize the nature of the Holocaust. Okay. So that is a great thing to start with. You also have a definition of genocide here, if you need that. And then we go into the next lesson in Unit 1, and it's looking at pre-war Jewish life. Again, even if you have a limited amount of time, and I hope as we're going through today, even though we have just a brief time together, I really hope that you're kind of thinking about which of these would work in your classroom, right? Which things could you go back and maybe take another look at and integrate into what you already do or what you're going to do. So when you're teaching about the Holocaust, I really hope that everybody has at least a little time. It may not be a lot, but to talk about pre-war Jewish life. And one way to do that is I'm not going to show it in the interest of time, but there's this great, very short film on glimpses of Jewish life before the Holocaust that comes from Yad Vashem. It's excellent. My new favorite from this unit in the update that they did is this activity. And again, we're just going to look at a small piece of it. It's called Profiles of Teenagers in Pre-War Europe. And they have several. You'll see the table of contents. There are 6 of them, and they're really interesting. All of them are so different. So the way I did it is I printed these for my students. We did this fall because it just came out, I think, maybe over the summer or fall. And so I printed these out and gave students different, they each just got one, right? They read it for homework. And then the next day I put them into groups with people who had the same, like everybody who had Annie got into a group. They had highlighted and annotated her story. I'll show you what this looks like. There it is. It gives you a little bit of background. And again, they chose people who were from some different places and had really different experiences. Annie kept a diary. And I love the fact that they have a copy of the diary, first of all, with her photo. Not all of them have, you know, anything like that. And then it breaks it down. So here's 1934, and I'm just going to highlight a couple of them. Tomorrow we are getting our marks, our grades, right? I'm only worried about arithmetic. To me, there's that relevancy piece, right? We have students who, oh my gosh, math, right? Or English or whatever class, right? And they're worried about it. March 31st, this is another one that makes her relevant to students. Lucy, her sister, has read my diary. As a punishment, I will no longer tell her any stories. She sticks her snooping little nose into everything, right? And so it just makes her more, I think, personable, more relatable. Like, you know, again, she's our students' ages. She's a tween at this point, right? On April 6th, here's one of her first experiences with anti-Semitism. She says, how rough boys can be. Today, some Latvians called me a kosher body and threw paper at me. I simply told them, you're a bunch of stupid boys. But why this enmity? Didn't the Jews shed their blood alongside the Latvians in the fight for Latvia's freedom? Then we were appreciated, but now that Latvia is free, they can do without us. Is that just? But the Jews will not be kicked around forever. One day they too will see the dawn of liberty. If Latvia could gain its freedom, why shouldn't Palestine be able to do the same? And I love that too, because so many times our students say, why didn't the Jews fight back? She may not have physically fought back, but I mean, this is a form of resistance, and writing in her diary is a form of resistance. I love that piece. This is not her, but it is a picture of teenagers from her area. And then when we get to the end of that year, from the excerpt, September 23rd, I want to amount to something. Most of all, I want not to be forgotten after my death. And again, she's so young to be thinking about this. And yet here she is, you know, saying this at about what, I think she's about 10 years old at this point, and thinking about that. And then we get into 1935, again, looking at the unfairness. They sang 2 Latvian hymns in the synagogue, not the Jewish one. So again, kind of thinking about that anti-Semitism. In 1936, yesterday the class party took place after all. After tea, there was a dance. I'm seldom asked for a dance. You know, again, feeling the outsider, like so many of our, she would be 12 at this point, and how many of our kids could relate to that. Again, that's a tragedy of the Jews. That is our tragedy. And then going into 1937, this one my students were blown away with, because again, she's 13 years old at this point. And this is a picture that does include her, but just how mature she is. She says, if God came down to earth and asked, what have you done with the world I gave you? Did you look after it well? Did you deal with each other as is seemly between brothers and human beings? In reply, men would cast their eyes down and keep their silence, especially the white race. The English, French, and Italians make life hell for their colored brethren. And again, she's just so astute at this point. And so I think 1, 2, 3, third person from the left, I think this is her. It's either this one or this one. Anyway, third row from the bottom. So there are 6 of these diaries, and they all, not all are diaries, I apologize, they're all writings. And then after you use that, so there is, besides the reflections or profiles, there are reflections. This is a graphic organizer, I use that as well. And then there are epilogues. So when you, and again, these are all printable. This tells you what happened to them. And so after my students discussed, and then they came back and they shared with the whole group a little bit about each person's story, so everybody got to experience the highlights. Then we read through to find out what happened to them. And so this gives some facts about her area. Her diary was found by a German soldier in the family's apartment. He sent it to a friend in Germany, and then it was later found and donated to Yad Vashem. And they didn't know her name at first. She had pasted this photograph of herself, that she only wrote her first name, but she was later identified by 2 survivors who had attended school with her. And so then it tells that she was shot and killed in the Rumbala forest with her family, either October 30th or November 1st, 1941. And that is part of what we call that Holocaust by bullets that took place in the East. So it's a really great lesson, again, to show that people had full lives. Not all of them, you know, ended this way, but what did they do before? You know, what were their thoughts and feelings before all of these things took place? So it's a really great lesson. So now I want to take you, when we go back over to this kind of hamburger thing, we're going to go into the unit called Antisemitism. And again, please stop me if you need clarifications or have questions, or put it in the chat box. Again, like I told you, everything is set up exactly the same. And I'm going to stop sharing for just a second because I need to highlight for sound to make sure that you can hear this, because I'm going to play one of the testimonies. I also want to point out that a lot of the units have a video toolbox. These are great for teachers. I wouldn't use it in the classroom because some of them do have some things that might be a little heavy for our students. I don't use them in the classroom, but they're great to watch. They're 15 minutes long, and they just give you more background knowledge. So this is on the history of anti-Semitism, looking at anti-Semitism even before the Holocaust. So we're going to look at Mr. Sinison. They always have a little biography that I share with my students. So he was born in 1925 in Berlin. He did not experience life in the ghettos or camps. In 1939, he and his brother fled to France to live with their uncle. Of course, the Nazis entered France then, and so he and his brother were sent to live in an orphanage and then later fled to the US. And that's where he was interviewed, and he was 14 when the war began. So here he is.
We lived in the center of Berlin. My parents were upper middle class. My father was a sales representative for a large textile mill. He earned a very nice living. We had a nice apartment. The ambience was cultured. We had music. I remember my parents dressing up in evening clothes and going to the opera. We had theater, and they would take us along. We were comfortable economically, at least before the National Socialist regime took over in Germany. I'm talking about the early years that I remember, in the early 1930s, before 1933. My father, in particular, was German first and Jewish second. Now, this does not mean that he was not an observant Jew. We were what was then called observant. In this country, in the USA, this can be translated into conservative. We observed all the holidays. We went to services Friday night and Saturday morning. If my father didn't have to work, he made sure that I went and my brother went. We both, my brother and I, sang in the synagogue choir. Usually the synagogues had boys' choirs. We celebrated all the holidays. My father never worked on the holidays. We were, without keeping a kosher home, yet we observed all the traditions.
How might that be, and again, you can unmute or put it in the chat box, how might that be relatable actually to students who are not Jewish? I know my population at my school, I don't have any Jewish students. I don't know about you all, but how could that still be relatable to somebody who's not Jewish? Because he used a lot of terms about the Jewish faith that we might have to unpack, and those are in the glossary. But how could that still be relatable, do you suppose? Any thoughts on that? How his testimony could still be relatable? Yeah, the other minority groups, family life, exactly, is always relatable. Do you remember what he said about what his father said? We are this first and this second. Right? It was German first and Jewish second. And my kids got that. And how he said, you know, I have to explain that conservative is not talking about politics, but about religion, you know, in this case. But it's a quick conversation, right? You can explain a few things about the Jewish faith, the menorah behind him, for example. But I think it's really important to show them that his family, what he's saying is that they assimilated, right? They fit in with the German culture. They weren't, you know, his father as a conservative Jew would not have had the beard or worn the hat or, you know, some of the stereotypical traditional things that our students might think of. So in other words, they were assimilated. And so, you know, again, here are some questions that you could give your students. I just like to have a good discussion with them after that. So that's looking at him earlier. Now we're going to follow up. And that was a really quick clip, under 2 minutes, right? That's what I love about these, because You can play them, and if you need to, you could play them again. But this is the second part, again, very short, and he's going to kind of follow up on some of those points.
It so happened that the best school in the neighborhood where we lived, in terms of academic work and also the most convenient, was a Catholic elementary school. Now, Catholic elementary schools were supported by the Catholic Diocese of Berlin, but they were not, as in this country, taught by nuns or brothers. They were lay teachers, and basically they had the same curriculum as the city schools, with the exception that after regular classes there was a class in catechism, and the Jewish kids in the school, and there were a dozen or so, were excused from that, and we could go home early. And we did. Now, this was about 1931 and 1932. In 1933, when the Nazis came to power, this started to change, because my classmates, who were my little friends, and we visited each other and played together and did our homework together, what have you, must have picked up new vibrations at home, because suddenly they called us dirty Jew, they called us other names, they would not play with us, they would not invite us. Some of their parents would telephone my parents and say, I hope you understand, but if my son plays with your son and his other friends will, etc. They knew what was going on. They made excuses, but it didn't stop. It was not an official policy of the school. The teachers were very fair. This was never permitted in class. There was never any reference in class to anything like that, unless the public schools, where the anti-Semitism had become suddenly very rampant.
And so there we get that little, bit of, okay, so things do change when Hitler comes into power, right? That doesn't mean there wasn't anti-Semitism before. And this unit, there is a lesson on that I'm going to show you real quickly where to get that information. But the fact that it ramps up, right? And how he, as a kid, was affected by that. I also want to point out there are longer biographies. I'm not going to open this up, but these are like a full page to give you more information about each of the survivors. And again, there are, well over 50 of these testimonies embedded in the different units. And so this is where, again, there are so many things that I'm not going to go over with you today in the interest of time, but I want to show you just real quickly. This is a great piece, again, for defining our terms. Definition of anti-Semitism. I just put this up on the board, on the projector, but you could print it and have your kids highlight key terms. It's just, basically a half page, 3/4 of a page with an image. But I love to break down this first sentence with them. Anti-Semitism is the term for the hatred of Jews as a group or a concept, because again, I think for my students and maybe some of yours who maybe, and probably in my students' case, they don't know a Jewish person. They've never met a Jewish person. And so to them, a Jewish person is a concept, right? They don't know anybody, so they can't identify that. And so thinking about, okay, well, when we view people as a concept, that's where sometimes misunderstanding or fear or hatred comes in. And again, talking about this long history of it. There's a great article. I'm not going to open it up, but it's about 2 pages that gives you a summary of anti-Semitism. I use that with my students. You could use this timeline kind of graphic organizer. And this shows that long history going way, way, way back, right? And super interesting for them to know that this did not begin with Hitler. In fact, he took most of the ideas that he had that were anti-Semitic from other times. I want to show you one more activity in this unit, and then we'll briefly look at one more unit. Again, there are handouts on Nazi ideology. Here's a summary of anti-Semitism, all kinds of great. There's Mr. Sinison again. This is a great testimony, really good stuff here. But I want to just look at a couple of examples because our students, I know they love images. And if you're familiar with this, this is a children's book from 1938 called The Poisonous Mushroom. Again, you could print these and give them to students to analyze closely. They're better in color. I don't have a color printer, so we do them on the projector. But this was, again, a children's book. And it was published and given to lots of German children for Christmas. And it had stories in it. You can go to the Calvin College website, and they have all kinds of information about this, including all of the stories translated in English with the pictures that go with them. But this is the cover. And you can see the tropes they're picking up on, right? The stereotypical features of a Jewish man, the big nose, dark hair, I think the red beard is a nod to communism. This idea that they populate wherever they go. Just in case you don't get it, there's the Star of David. And this goes with the lead story and the title, The Poisonous Mushroom, where a mother is out in the woods picking mushrooms with her children. And she tells them, just like mushrooms, there are poisonous people you need to be careful of, right? So that's kind of the premise. And each of these gives you a little explanation. I liked to show my students the image without the explanation and have them analyze it themselves first. But just looking at this, what would our students relate to this? How would they know exactly what's happening in this story? My students responded to this in 2 words. Is anybody else thinking of those 2 words? You can put it in the chat box or unmute. My kids said stranger danger, right? That's what this is about. Here's this man, again, stereotypical features, trying to give them candy. You can tell the little boy's kind of thinking about it. If you read the rest of the story, he runs away with his sister and goes home and tells his parents, and they reward him with candy because he did the right thing and got his sister away from this scary Jewish person, right? And so again, there's the explanation. And I'll just show you, there are a couple more. This one picks up on German stereotypes and what a German Aryan family looked like. And here's another one in an Aryan classroom, right? So anyway, that's a great activity that you can use as well. My students love those. And again, there is a graphic organizer for that as well. All right, but now in our last bit of time together, I'm going to take you to the 3rd unit, which is called Nazi Germany. And this one, I'm just, again, going to feature a couple of lessons. But what I did with these kind of greatest hits, you could easily do these in a week if you had it. Again, you could take pieces of it and condense it and do it in less time. If you're an ELA teacher, it would be great, like before studying a book. If you use, like a memoir, like Night or something, these would be great to look at before you start something like that. Lots of ways that you could use these. This activity I like to do with my students because it really gets them thinking about themselves, again, making it relatable, where I just hand this out and I ask them to rank these. So what's most important and what's least important. So there you can see all of them. What would be number 1 for you all? And again, you can put it in the chat or you can unmute. Read through them and then let me know what would be the most important to you. So what's your number 1? Be a citizen of your country. Okay, thanks, David. Citizen, Holly agrees. What else? Any others that you think are important to you? Date or marry? Yeah, Mandy, I agree. That would be top on my list. A lot of my students have that one too. Any others that are different from what we've said so far? Some of my kids, and I think it's because I have seniors and some of them are getting to be that age, will say vote. And I agree, because, you know, if you can vote, you might be able to, you know, if some of these are threatened to be taken from you, you might be able to vote for people who would help protect those rights. Yeah, I think those would be important. I have a lot of students who, when they do this one, say eating what they want is very important, right? So this is a good way to get the students thinking about what's important to them, but then again, using maybe like a T-chart like this, or thinking about how the rights were taken away from the Jewish people of Germany. And so this goes into the history aspect of it, looking at the land and what the maps look like before 1919 and then after the Treaty of Versailles, and how much, you know, that really looks like, and how the maps change. There's a great handout that gives a lot of the background and history of that on the Weimar Republic and the rise of the Nazi Party. And there's a good graphic organizer again that your students could use. Again, here are some discussion questions. Here's a journaling activity that you could do that brings in actually a quote from Margaret Atwood, which I think is really cool. As an English teacher, I love that. And then here's where they get into, you know, the specific aspects that affected their lives. And so here are a couple of testimonies people who were immediately affected by that. Margaret Lambert was an athlete who should have participated in the Olympics and didn't. Here's some anti-Jewish policy, anti-Jewish signs, lots of great visuals. Here's, my students are always really interested in the Hitler Youth. So here's a handout about them. And then one about concentration camps, because again, when we're talking about being specific with our terms and definitions, concentration camps are not the extermination camps, right? That come later, the killing centers. Those are two different things. And so what does that mean in 1933 when we have concentration camps being built all over Germany? This, just by the way, is one of the few testimonies we have in the lessons that is by a non-Jewish person, and she is Roma, and she has a really interesting story about the Hitler Youth. And then we get into, I was briefly in the last session, and I heard somebody talking about Kristallnacht. I love this lesson, and I use it every year because it has a lot of great primary sources. So yes, you have photographs, right? You have testimonies, which are excellent. Here is just a nice overview of what happened and the background of it. And then you get these primary sources. So you get Heydrich's instructions saying exactly what should happen and what shouldn't happen on the night of Kristallnacht. For example, he said there should be no looting. Well, we know looting happened. There are photographs that show that. You know, he said that all male Jews that are healthy and younger should be arrested, but that the elderly and women and children should be left alone, right? So my students always think that's interesting, because when we get to the extermination, the killing centers, it's the exact opposite, right? And then there's a letter by a woman whose money was stolen on that night, and she's asking for it back. It's a really interesting letter, very brief. Here's a narrative of a man who runs an orphanage and is just telling step by step, this is what's happening, right? And some of his shock at what's happening. And then you get a couple more photographs. And then to use with that, you have this great document analysis sheet. And so again, I did this with my students. I put them into groups with all of the documents, and they were able to work with all of them and kind of see this didn't just happen, right? We don't want our students thinking that these events were inevitable, that, oh, they just happened, right? it was bound to happen. No, they were very carefully planned and thought out. And, you know, when Herschel Greenspan, the 17-year-old Jewish boy who did the shooting of Ernst von Roth in Paris, they were waiting for a moment like that. And the Nazis fully took advantage of that situation. So these are great resources for Kristallnacht. And then the last lesson in this unit, again, you get some more testimonies. But if you haven't used this before, I really love using the Pyramid of Hate. And it just shows, and I use Kristallnacht as an example, that it starts with these biased attitudes, right? Where, you know, I liken it with my students that you hear a joke that's racist or sexist, or you know, somebody called a name or something. It's not you doing it, but you hear it and you don't challenge it. You just kind of accept it. And then it goes up to where you are that active participant. So now you're retelling that joke, or you're avoiding people because of who they are. And then that leads to discrimination, which again, I point out to my students, these are all illegal, but they still happen, right? And unfortunately, my students often can give me examples of that happening. And then it goes up to the bias motivated violence, which we see all of this, except for cyber terrorism, we see all of this on Kristallnacht. The desecration of the synagogues, the arson, murder, there were 91 people killed that night, terrorism, threats, assault, absolutely, all of that happened. And so this is a great way to look at that, but then also to think about at what could be done at, you know, at each level to stop it. And if it had stopped at one of these levels, you know, the idea that it wouldn't get to these, if we could stop things down here. And what does that look like, right? How do we stop that, stop these horrible acts from happening? So I like to put that back into my students' hands with some action and things that they can do, right? And not just kind of wringing our hands and saying, oh, this is back in history and it's terrible, and gosh, it's a good thing this stuff never happened again, right? Okay, so I want to end with, first of all, do we have any questions that I can answer about anything that you heard? If any clarifications on how to use the website, anything at all that, or anything else that we have available in those other units that we didn't get to use. So I hope you're able to go into it and really look at it. Look at those activities. Like I said, they're very user friendly. And I use them all the time. Unfortunately, it came out in 2005 and I had already built all of my units. I'm going to put that in the box for James. There you go, echoesandreflections.org. But you know, when I was building my class, this would have been really helpful. I had been teaching my class for about 4 years when this came out, but I started immediately supplementing, and there's still things that are original to the lessons that I still use in my classroom because they're so good. Like I said, it has changed a little bit. So for those of you who may have looked at Echoes in the past or do use it, it has changed a little bit. Like the Kristallnacht lesson used to be in Unit 1, now it's in the 3rd one. But it's really, they've added some great things. And they've changed lessons 1 through 5 up through the final solution. 6 through 10 are coming soon and will be changed sometime, I want to say probably by summer. I saw that Mandy put a survey. I also have one for, I apologize for doing double duty here, but Echoes and Reflections always asks us to do follow-ups. And yes, David, I will give you the attendance form in just a minute. So the one that I put, the Qualtrics, just put in that it was 1 hour. It was ADL is our sponsor for this. And again, my name is Kim Klett, and then I will put that link for the sign-in sheet for Echoes in again, if anybody needs it, if you didn't sign in for me. And again, I hope you can join us on May 19th. May 19th, we're going to be doing a specialty session called Choices Matter. It is probably my favorite specialty one to teach, because it really gets into choices that people made, whether it's the Nazis choosing to do the horrible things they did, or countries that chose not to act. It's really excellent. So I hope you can join us. And again, that's through the Department of Education in Nevada, and it's on May 19th. Mandy, do you have anything else you need to let them know?
Well, thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. I am just excited to go check out that website more in depth. So as I mentioned at the very beginning of the session, we have multiple surveys and multiple attendance sheets. So one is for the organization that Kim was representing. They take their own data, and so they need that information. But then I've also put in a couple of links for the Department of Education. So you need to fill that out as well in order to get your certificate for today. So make sure that you click on all of the links and fill out all of the information. Again, you know, you have a couple of minutes. So it's 11:28 now. The final, the third roundtable session will begin at 11:35. So you have a few minutes to go ahead and fill that out. We'll be here in case you have any questions, if you have anything that you need to follow up with about any of the surveys or information. I see that Kim has put her email contact. So if you're interested in reaching out to Kim, go ahead and make sure you take down her contact information. Thank you all so much for spending your Saturday here with us. Thank you so much, Kim, for your amazing presentation. And with that, if you are done filling out, you can go ahead and you have your 5-minute break until 11:35 when the roundtable session begins.
Thank you, everybody.